there, welcome to Lessons with Lindsay. My name is Lindsay Wilkes and I'm the owner of the Cottage Mama and author of the book So Classic Clothes for Girls. I'm so happy you could join me today. We have a wonderful tutorial in store for you. We are going to be sewing the party dress. The party dress is a free pattern that you can find over on my blog by signing up for the newsletter. My blog is thecottagemama.com/blog, and at the top of the blog you'll see a subscription button. You can sign up for the party dress and it will arrive in your email inbox. The pattern is sized from 6 months up to girls size 10. It's a wonderful pattern to start out with if you are just getting into sewing for little girls, or you want to try your hand at making a fancier dress for your little one. So we're going to go through lots of tips and tricks, and I'll be changing up this pattern a little bit and show you some of the things I like to do when creating this dress. So let's get started. Okay, so here we have the party dress. Isn't this a fun dress for little girls? It's the perfect fancy dress. This dress I actually created for my girls to wear as flower girls. I know this isn't the most conventional fabric that you would see for a flower girl dress, but the entire wedding was based around the pretty colors in this fabric. So that's how this dress came to be. And it's a really basic classic silhouette for a little girl. We've just got a nice lined bodice here, and then we have a big thick sash with this gathered skirt and then a contrast band at the bottom. And on the back, one of the reasons this is such a great pattern if you're a beginner is I know that buttons and zippers can really be intimidating if you're just starting out sewing. So this dress actually doesn't have any buttonholes or any zipper insertions. So we've got these loops back here with the buttons. And I've seen some really creative things done with this using larger loops, larger buttons, and all different kinds of things back here. And then we have this pretty big sash. I just love big bows on little girls. I think it's so precious. And I've got a great video if you are unsure how to tie the perfect bow for your little girl's dress. You can check out that video and find out how to tie this bow. But this is a nice big sash. Now what we're going to do today is we're actually going to narrow this front sash a little bit, and I'm going to show you how to include some trim with that sash, and we're going to add trim into the armholes. So let's take a look at the pieces that you're going to need when starting to sew your party dress, okay? So I have some different trim options here, and some of these I'm just showing you as ideas for you to get creative, because that's what's wonderful about a basic, classic dress like this is there's all sorts of ways that you can make it your own. So I have some fun trims here, and I'll explain where we can possibly put those later. So here we have our bodice pieces that we're going to be using when sewing the party dress. We have our front exterior fabric, and we have our 2 back exterior fabrics. Then you're going to have exactly the same pieces for your lining. You could use the same fabric as I've done here, or you could use a contrasting fabric just to change it up for your lining pieces. Then right here I have this little piece of fabric cut out for the loops for the back of the dress. And I'm going to show you a different way to make these loops that you haven't seen in the pattern. And again, you can choose to use a fabric that's very similar to the bodice, or you can use a different fabric. I chose to use the fabric for the skirt for the loops, just to bring some of that color up into the back of the dress. And then we've got our buttons. I thought these were really sweet flower buttons here, and they kind of pull out this pretty, I guess we'll call it coral pink color. And so these are just fun for a little girl. And then I have this piping. This piping is pre-made piping. It's in a really nice cotton fabric though. I do have a video about how to make your own piping and more details about inserting piping. So be sure to check that out if you're really interested in starting to add trim to your different garments. So we've got that. And then up here, I've got my sash pieces. So you're gonna notice here, this sash piece is a little bit more narrow than you're going to find in the pattern, and I'm going to show you why we're going to use a more narrow sash this time around. But then we've got our 2 side sash pieces here as well. And then we're going to come over to the skirt fabric, and I just love this pattern. I think this is going to make an adorable Easter dress with the little bunnies and the birds. One thing I do want you to take note of is that this is a directional fabric. And what that means is that the pattern is going one way, whereas here on our swan fabric, we could cut it the opposite way and it's not really going to matter. But if we cut and sew with this in the opposite direction, then our bunnies and our birds are going to be upside down. And nobody might notice, but I like to really make sure that I'm using my directional fabric in the way it was intended. So we've also got a directional fabric here. This is going to be for our contrast band at the bottom of the skirt. And this has the flowers and the little bunny peeking out here. And so we're going to attach this piece to our skirt. So some of the techniques we're going to get to focus on today is gathering. If you've never gathered, don't worry. I'm going to take you through every step of the way. And again, I've also got another video that goes into even more details about gathering. But this is going to give you a good head start for sewing and gathering. We are going to focus on inserting and using piping and trim. And we are also going to be focused on learning how to sew a lined bodice. So these are all great techniques that are going to carry you through to whether you're using cottage mama patterns or some other type of patterns. This is going to give you the foundation to really get sewing for your little one. So I say we just better head to the sewing machine and get this dress started. So now we're going to get started on the bodice for our party dress. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be narrowing the front sash so that we can incorporate some fun trim into the front of this dress. So as you can see here, I have cut this center sash piece the same width as the party dress bodice front. So I'd say this piece I've cut here is approximately 2.5 to 3 inches. That size is going to change depending on what size party dress you're sewing. If you're sewing a real teeny tiny size, you may not want the center sash to be quite so thick, and vice versa if you're sewing up to size 10. So that's going to be a step where you're going to use your own creative license to cut this how you would like it. So we have our center sash piece, and then I'm going to take my store-bought piping that I have here, and I'm just going to unwind this and figure out about how much we need. I always like to go a little bit past the sides. I want to have my piping pointing down towards the bottom of the sash here for this section. So I'm going to flip this up and apply my tape to the opposite side. This is a double-sided sticky tape that you can use to hold all sorts of different things in place, but I like to use it for trims. This will wash out when the garment's been laundered, and it also won't gum up your needle. So it's a great product when you don't really want to use pins. And then I'm going to take this paper backing off of the piping. This is actually a 1/2 inch seam allowance already. Luckily for us here, we're just going to be able to line this right up with the edge of our fabric. You need to be very conscious of what seam allowance your piping or trim is using, because you may have to adjust your seams. Okay, so now we're going to stitch our piping to the sash front. And as you can see here, I'm going to just use my regular J foot, which is just the standard presser foot that comes with the machine, and I like to sew in the left needle position. That's just where I'm most comfortable, but you can sew in whatever position you like. Now, if you check out my piping video, you'll see me use the piping foot that is an additional foot that goes on this machine, and it's wonderful. Especially if you're doing a little bit thicker cording, that foot is going to be a really great tool. Let's take a couple back stitches here, and you're just essentially going to sew right on top of the stitching. Okay, so we're just basting this in place, and you're going to see that the cording is just going to fit real nicely into the groove of this foot. Okay, now let's take a couple back stitches and cut our thread. I do love the thread cutter. Let's grab our iron. Okay, let's see how we're looking here on this side. Oh, that's looking nice. So now once I've got this, I just take my scissors and cut off the extra here. Okay, and then same thing here. What I want to do is I'm going to open up my front bodice piece here. And we are just going to put this, line this right up with the bottom. Okay. So I've got some pins in here just to kind of hold this in place. We're just going to top stitch this to the bodice front. All right, and you can use either an 1/8 inch or even smaller than that, whatever you're comfortable with. You're just going to get real close next to the piping. We are going to make sure we set our stitch length back to our normal length. Give myself a few back stitches, of course, and then move on forward. And a little note about thread, I'm using white thread here, but I could use blue. That would be really pretty. I always tend to like to use a lighter thread. So when in doubt, go light, I say, because you don't want your thread to show too much. And the darker thread always shows a whole lot more. So lighter is better. All right, let's get... Now, another thing that I like to do when I'm using this technique for our center sash is I like to come in here and lift this up and remove this part of the bodice. That's gonna take some of the bulk out, so we're not having a double layer attached to our skirt. Something else I thought might be really nice would be to add a couple buttons here. I think that would be really cute, or a little bow would be really nice. Also, if you wanted to add some extra detail here, maybe add a little bib front with some extra trim, that would be a great addition to this dress, but we're gonna keep it a little bit more simple today. So let's grab our other pieces and start putting the bodice together. What we need to do now is we need to sew the shoulder seams for these pieces. So we're just gonna match up the shoulder seams here. We're gonna sew these shoulder seams together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance because that's what our pattern calls for. So put your presser foot down, get a little back stitch action there. And let's move on forward here. Okay. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing with the other side. So you want to make sure when you are starting a sewing pattern that you read the pattern completely before you start to sew. And definitely make note of your seam allowances so that you'll know, is it the same seam allowance throughout the whole pattern? Or are there different changes in the seam allowance? Because that can really make a big difference in the way your garment turns out. Let's just take this here to our iron. Press these open. Now what we're going to need to do is we are going to need to pretty much do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it with our lining pieces. So let's move our exterior pieces to the side and grab our lining pieces. We've got essentially our front, but this is, again, the lining. It could be in a different fabric. Sometimes I like to do that because it's fun, but I just use the same one here. All right, and we're gonna live on the wild side here and not pin. All right. Okay, and then we've got this side. Just gonna place that on top. Get it lined up. There we go, that looks pretty good. Okay, so then we've got our lining pieces sewn here together. So we'll take this to the iron and do the same thing, pressing our shoulder seams open. A good iron is a very important tool in sewing. Okay, and then we've got this side. What we're gonna do is we are actually gonna make the loops for the back of our dress bodice before we start putting the lining and the exterior fabrics together. So we're just gonna grab this piece here, which I just cut a long strip of the skirt fabric to use for the loops. But another option would be if you have some spaghetti bias, that would be a wonderful option to use for the loops. Or you could use ribbon. So a nice thin ribbon would be a really good option. Or even some store-bought bias tape that you could just fold in half and top stitch. That would be another option. So lots of different things you can do here if you're not wanting to make these loops with fabric. But today we're going to make these loops. Now in the pattern, I instruct you to sew your loops by simply folding this in half and sewing down this side and then turning it right side out. However, I've heard from a lot of you that that is really tricky, especially if you do not have a loop turner tool. So we're going to show another technique that is going to make your life easier in this department, and you can use this if you don't have that tool. We are going to take our iron and just, I'm going to start on this side, and just fold in these two sides, and this does not have to be super, super precise. Also, if you had one of those little bias tape makers, those little tools that they sell, you might have seen them at your local sewing supply shop. That would be another great way to get this portion of the loops completed. But I find it pretty easy just to kind of hold it here. Just make sure you don't get too close to the iron because that steam can burn. Okay, and then we're gonna hold this down here. Just kind of keep going. And this fabric is actually, this is Michael Miller. The fabric line is Summer by Sarah Jane Studios. And it is a woven cotton, but it's printed on their Cotton Couture line, which is really beautiful to sew for. It's got a little bit more of a garment feel to it, not quite the same as the quilting cotton, but it's the same composition. So you might check that out if you start getting into sewing for children or just sewing garments. Okay, let's turn it this way. Get those together there. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we are going to fold it in half again. So you can make these loops as skinny or as wide. I wouldn't probably go more than a 1/2 inch wide on these, but it's kind of up to you how you could make it even skinnier than these though. More of a spaghetti look. But this is going to work just fine for us. All right. So as you can see, this, you do not have to turn anything inside out, right side out for this, doing it with this technique. Okay, so now we have our nice piece of fabric, long piece of fabric here, and we're going to stitch down this side real close to the edge so that it doesn't come apart. You know, another real basic sewing tip if you're new to sewing is that when you are using this hand, probably your left hand, you don't really want to be holding the fabric or pushing the fabric through your sewing machine. This hand really is just there to guide it. You know, really light fingers. That's what my grandmother taught me. And I've thought about that ever since I started sewing for my kids. You know, you barely want this hand to be doing much with the fabric. Now, of course, when you're sewing curves and things like that, sometimes this hand comes a little bit more into play, but for the most part, you're gonna get a straighter line. Let the machine do its thing. These machines are really great at just pulling this fabric. And occasionally, you know, you might stitch too close to the edge and you didn't catch the other side. No big deal. It's hardly gonna show, and you can just go back and go a little farther in and catch the other side. So here you can see now we've got our nice long piece of fabric to cut into our 4 loop pieces. Okay, so now we need to grab our buttons here and we need to figure out what size loops we're gonna make. These are fairly large buttons for this dress. So what I like to do is I just like to take my strip that I've made here and I kind of set it right here on the edge of my bodice, because something that's really important to note is that you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So good half inch of this is going to not be here and not be used for your button. So I just like to kind of fold this in half and see, go like this and see, is my button going to fit in there? Oh, yes, it is. Okay, so I may want it even a little bit smaller, maybe. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna take a 1/2 inch out there. And I think that's gonna be pretty good. I mean, I would rather a loop be a tiny bit bigger than too small, because we can't really go back in and change that. So I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to just keep my loop like this, and I'm gonna take my scissors and give this a cut here. And then we'll just use this as our guide for the other 3 loops that we need. So just take that and cut. And then we need 2 more. So luckily this strip was plenty long enough for us to get our 4 loops out of it. Also, these loops are good for scraps. So if you have some scraps you want to use up that you think will coordinate with your garment, you could grab those as well to make these little loops. So we need to figure out how we are going to place our loops here on the back of the bodice. Now, when I originally wrote this pattern, I showed you how to fold these loops in half and place them here on your bodice and evenly space them out. And that completely works. But since I've been sewing this dress for several years now, I've learned a new technique that I think looks even nicer on the back of the dress. So what we're gonna do is we are going to turn our loop like this, and we're just gonna butt these 2 edges up together, if you can see that right there. And we're gonna run these through our sewing machine, just lining it up with the edge of the presser foot. And we'll do that for all 4 of our loops. And then that way, it'll be nice and easy for us to space these at the back of the bodice. So let's do that. Let's just place these together like this. Come over here to our sewing machine. Place them under our machine presser foot with the edge just approximately to the edge of the foot. Okay? And this is just to secure these together so that it'll be a little bit easier when we do our placement. So kind of hold those together. And I just always take a back stitch for everything. I know not everybody does that, but different strokes for different folks. Okay, so let's do this one. Just got to kind of hold those together here. Okay, so now we can take one of our other pieces here, and we can just continue along and chain stitch these together. Okay, cut our threads here. And then we've got these 3 pieces, so we just need to cut them apart, easy. Okay, now we have our 4 loops. So you want to take your hem gauge If you don't have a hem gauge, it's definitely something you want to have in your sewing tools collection. I use this pretty much for every single garment that I sew. It's just such a handy tool to have. So grab your hem gauge, and we want to place our first loop pretty much a little bit over a 1/2 inch below the neckline here. Okay, so let's take this and we're gonna place our loops. You want the loop to be pointing away from the edge of the dress bodice back, and then just take some pins and pin it in place. Okay, so let me measure down. Where do I want the top of this? Okay, so that's going to be my starting point for this one. Okay, and just put a pin in here. All right, and now I want to figure out where I want this bottom one to be. So again, we're going to use about the same distance that we just used, although I like to take it just maybe a hint bigger there, because you never know with that gathered skirt there. Let's take it up just a tad. Okay, and again, this is just all based on what looks good to you and what works for you. Okay, I've got it about there, and we will stick our pin in it. Now, again, you don't want this one too low because you don't want it to get caught in the seam of your gathered skirt. Okay, so now here you can either measure precisely and figure out where you want these to be. You know, grab your tailor's measure, or you can just eyeball it, which is fine, until you feel like these are pretty evenly spaced. Let me see. I think that looks pretty good, don't you? Okay, so we're gonna put a pin in this one. And then put a pin in this one. And then we'll just take this back over to the machine, and I just want to baste these in place because I like them to be secured. This pin just doesn't really want to go in there, so let's grab a different one. Okay, there we go. Okay, make sure these are all nice and straight. Okay, so I'm just going to take this stitch length up to 3 for when I baste. You could leave it at 2.5, but. Okay, so you want to sew this maybe at about 1/4 inch. We just are really looking to hold these in place here. All right, so sew down this edge. You can take out the pins as you go if you want. I think I'll be okay there. Make sure they're kind of straight. And there we go. Okay. All right. So now we've got our loops, and they are just all hanging out here, ready to be sewn into our dress bodice. Okay. Now here's where we are going to make a little change from the original pattern. We are going to add piping into these armholes here. It's a really fun addition to have this great detail that is going to be shown at the waist sash that we added in the bodice, and then also in the armholes. So let's grab this one so we can get a better look at that. Remember what I was talking about with the piping here? So we're going to add that same piping into these armholes. Okay, so we need to grab our piping. I've got that over here. And then I'm going to grab my Wonder Tape. Again, this is completely optional. I just think it's going to make your life a little bit easier. So I'm going to actually add the piping to this exterior piece. It doesn't really matter where you're going to baste it in place, but I just want to add it to this one since this is where I added the other piping. So lay this out in front, and again, we are adding piping into both of the armholes. And I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance piping, which is going to make our life a lot easier. Okay, so let's unwind some piping and roughly figure out how much we need here. I just kind of like to go like this. Okay, we're going to need about that much and a little extra for good measure. Okay, cut. And that means we're probably going to need about the same amount for the other side. So let's use this, measure it out, and give it a cut. Okay, and this is really nice piping. The quality of the material definitely makes a difference when you are using piping. A lot of the store-bought piping is made out of a polyester or synthetic fabric, which is fine to use. I've used that myself in a pinch. But this is a really nice cotton fabric, and it's just going to sew and lay a lot nicer in your garment. So if you have access to this or want to make your own piping, definitely go with a high-quality fabric that's going to lay really nice in your piece. Okay, so because this armhole here is not a real dramatic curve, okay, we're not going to have to worry too much about clipping this piping to help it lay flat. You can learn a lot more about using piping and trims and things in seams in my piping video, but this is just real basic here. So what we're going to do is we want our piping to be pointing in towards the bodice. Okay, so we need to add our tape to the back side here. All right, so flip this over and let's just add our tape. Just love this stuff. Okay, so we've got that one, and then let's just do the other one since we've got our piping out and ready to go. Okay. All right. Now we can set our Wonder Tape aside as well. Okay, so let's just take this first one and we are going to peel off the paper backing for this double-sided tape. There we go. Okay, I'll take that one off all the way. And again, we want the piping pointing in towards the center of the bodice. So you're going to start here. And you're just going to lay this piping right here. And you're going to work, because this is cut on the bias, it is going to curve with us. If you had a sharper curve, you might need to clip this so that it would lay flat. But this is going to be good for us, I think. Just make sure that gets nice and sticky there. Okay, coming around here. Coming around the curve. Also, another tip is if you're trying to take your piping around a curve, you can also press it in the shape of a curve, and that'll help it curve a little bit more for you. Okay, so that one's good. Then let's do this other armhole, okay? So we can stick that one on. So same thing, remove your paper backing. And make sure the piping is pointing in towards the center of the bodice. Line it up with the edge. It's really nice when you're able to just line the trim or piping up with the edge of the fabric. Certainly makes life easier. When you're making your own piping, it's always best to make piping with a little bit larger seam allowance because you can always cut that down. But if you've got a piping with a real tiny seam allowance, that can make just an extra step of things. Definitely doable, but larger seam allowance seems to work better. Okay, I'm just making sure I'm getting all nice and stuck down there. Okay, so we're looking good. Okay, we've got our piping all stuck in here. Now, if you were trying to skip a step, you could skip the next step if you didn't want to baste these in place, but I like to baste the piping in place because I want to be able to see the stitching line on the other side for my next step. I feel like it helps my piping get a little bit tighter and more precise, but again, if you just wanted to go for it and leave it here with the tape, you could certainly do that. But we are gonna take this to our machine here and just kind of baste this in place. All right, so let's do this one first. We're gonna put it under here. And again, I'm just using the basic J foot. You could use your piping foot or your zipper foot. And let's get going here. Oh, this is kind of pulling here. Okay. Just stitch right on top of that stitching or ever so slightly to the left. That's going to make sure the piping squeezes out nicely. Okay. Now, if you're a beginner sewer, you might want to skip this step completely. Just so, I think it's great to go through a pattern when you're a beginner and just feel really good about it so that you don't have any frustrations. And sometimes getting piping just right can add to your frustration. So if this is your first time, maybe skip this and do this on your second or third time through. All right, so now we've got our piping basted in place, and you can check your piping, make sure it looks okay to you just kind of by folding this back. See if it looks good. If you didn't go in tight enough to the piping, you could always bring it back over to your presser foot and just run it a little bit tighter. But this is looking pretty good. So let's base stitch the other side so that this one will be ready to go. So same thing here. There we go, a couple back stitches. Okay, and then we'll start sewing here. Again, sew right on top of that stitching or just ever so slightly to the left. Slow down a little bit on the curve there. Okay, so let's see what we have here. If we did okay, take a look and then fold it back like this. See what we're looking like here. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, great. So now we've got this piping all basted in place, and then I like to come in here and just take my scissors and trim off any of this excess that we have hanging off here. So we're neat and tidy for the next step. Okay, there, and right here. Okay, excellent. So now let's grab our other bodice piece here that we have, where we basted our loops in place. And I am going to take the lining fabric here. And again, you could have basted these loops to the exterior fabric. It really doesn't matter. You're just wanting to hold them in place here. So let's take this. And then we're going to take the exterior, the front, and we are going to lay these on top of each other. And I'm laying the exterior fabric on top because, as I mentioned before, I want to be able to see this stitch line when I sew the armholes. That's going to help me make sure I am really accurate with my piping. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to first line up your shoulder seams. That's where I like to start. So take a pin here. And we can just put this in and come over here. And let's line those up. Okay, and then I like to come back here to the back of the bodice in the corner there and give that a pin. And then do the same thing here. Okay, and then we'll put one in the middle. It just works better to start at the points that you really need to make sure they line up and then pin accordingly here. We'll put a couple here. And then, let's see, one more right here. All right, now same sort of thing down the back. So that was just the neck hole that I just pinned. Let's lay this out so you get a better look at that. So that's the neck hole. I'm going to pin down both sides of the back of the bodice, and then I'm going to also pin around the armholes. Okay, so let's continue here. We don't need too many pins in this section. It's pretty straight. Just get a couple. Just gonna put one right down here. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now, when we come over here to the armholes, we're gonna do something similar to what we did here. So we're gonna find our shoulder seams. We really wanna make sure that those are gonna line up. So let's just put a pin in here. And sometimes this piping is a little hard to pin through. Then I like to come down to where the armholes actually start and line that up. See, that was a little tough to get through there. Okay, and same thing over here. Just kind of line that up and put a pin in it. Okay, over here, just gonna turn this so that I can pin this a little easier. All right, pin the beginning of the armhole down here. And then let's get this one lined up here. Okay, so we're looking pretty good. We got some, I may add a couple more pins here once we've sewn our neck hole, but what we're gonna do is we are gonna sew up the back, around the neck, and back down the other side of the back. And then we are gonna come in and sew each armhole. Well, let's do the back and around the neck first, and then we'll worry about the armholes, all right? So now we're gonna change our stitch length back to the regular setting, which is 2.5. And you just wanna make sure this is lined up. You can always put more pins in there if you'd prefer. Okay, so right here I can feel that I'm about to come up to my loop. So I wanna make sure that I get past that loop before I make my curve here in the neck hole. So just kind of feel with your fingers. Do one more stitch, there we go. Okay, and then we're gonna turn here. Make sure that little loop here is out of the way. Sometimes I stick my finger in here and just make sure that it's not gonna get caught in our next row of stitching. There we go. Okay. And moving on. And this is when you're probably going to be using your left hand a little bit more to help guide the fabric on these curves. Let's make sure we're nice and lined up. We are looking good. Now just take it nice and slow if you are new to sewing curves. I know that can be a little intimidating if you're used to sewing to straight lines of stitches, if you came from the quilting side. But this isn't too hard as long as you just take it nice and slow. Okay. Pretty good. I'm going to take one more stitch there actually. One more. There we go. Okay, let's get lined up. Okay. Okay, so that is our neck hole and the back of our bodice. Now, I just want to add a few more pins in here to the armholes that we secured, just to make sure that this gets lined up. So I think I'm going to put 2 more pins here. I'm going to put another one here. And we'll do 2 more here. Just because I don't want this to get out of line. Okay. So that's looking good for this side. Okay, so now we're going to sew our armholes. Notice I have not turned this bodice right side out yet. We're still with the right sides together. So let's come over here. And I'm going to line up the needle pretty much with the row of my stitching that I did previously. Take a few back stitches to get going. And then here we go, but we don't want to do this too fast. Okay. So now we can open up our dress bodice here and just kind of check our piping. Make sure it looks like we want it to. And if it doesn't, it's no big deal. Just go back through and either sew closer to your stitching, or you can pick out some of your stitches and sew farther away. It's really easy to adjust when it comes to piping. So this side's looking good. So we are going to come over and sew this other armhole. And I do want to put a couple more pins in this one as well. Got that one, this one, and then this side. Okay, so now I think we're ready to sew this side. So again, we want to be able to see our stitching from where we basted the piping. And if you're using a piping foot, again, you might not need these basting stitches, but I like to have them handy. So let's try to get lined up there. Take a few back stitches to start, and then we'll get going. Okay, let's see how we did here. Check and see, make sure we didn't get too close anywhere. So again, you can just kind of check your stitching, see how you did. And I think we're looking good. All right, so let's lay this out in front of us here. And we need to do just a few things before we're gonna turn this right side out. So the first step is I want to trim these armholes down. I'm gonna use my pinking shears here to cut down the seam allowance. And the reason I like to use pinking shears is it kind of gives you this zigzag cut, which is actually gonna help this curve to lay nice and flat. So I'm gonna use these on the armholes as well as on the neck hole. So let's go in and cut these. And this is pretty thick to cut through, so make sure you've got a good pair of pinking shears. If you don't have pinking shears, you could certainly use your regular sewing scissors, but these just work really well for me. All right, so we'll put that to the side. Go over here to our other one. Okay. And now let's do the neck hole here. This is a little bit easier to cut because it's not so much bulk in there. Okay, and now you can see I've come to the end of that neck opening, but I also want to cut some bulk out of this corner here, so that corner is going to turn out nice and pointy. So I'm going to take these, you could use your regular scissors as well, and just cut that down. And I'm going to come back around to this one over here, and I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, get pretty close, but not all the way down to the stitches. And we'll move this to the side. And I didn't mention before, but in the original party dress pattern, I have two different ways of constructing this bodice. So the way I'm showing you here is the alternate bodice construction. I think that's best for beginners, but feel free to try either way. Okay, so once we've got everything nice and trimmed, we're going to turn this right side out. So you're just going to reach in one side and start pulling it to the other. And then do the same thing over here. Pull it through the armhole. It's a little bit trickier on the smaller sizes because sometimes those shoulder seams are pretty tiny, but just keep working it and you can pull it right through. Now these corners are turning out pretty well, but to get in there even tighter, I'm going to grab my point turner here, which is a wonderful tool for pushing out any of the corners. And actually, I like to use this side of the tool to press out curves for scallops and things like that. So it's pretty handy. So just come in here and kind of press that out gently. If you press too hard, you can end up poking through the fabric. So you don't want to get too wild with your point turner. I'm going to come in here. Okay. And, you know, you're welcome to put your loops on one side versus the other side. You know, there are rules, I guess, about the side in which girls close button versus boys close button, but whatever you want. It's totally fine. Okay, so let's come here to our iron and get some of this pressed out so we make it look a little prettier. Take this, and you might need to kind of roll this with your fingers. Sometimes that helps me to get this nice and flat. But take your iron and just kind of press this here. And we're going to move that. here. It's these curves. We definitely want to make sure that those get pressed during this section here. All right, let's do the other side, the other armhole. So we get those taken care of. And doesn't that piping look so cute? I just love adding piping. Okay, so let's press this. And a lot of what gets making a garment look nice is really in the pressing. So make sure you take the time to do this. Don't skip this step, please, please, please. You'll be much happier with your garment if you take the extra time to press. Okay. I'm gonna move this out of my way here. And then get the other curve here. Okay, that's looking good. Now we need to do the back of the bodice and the neck hole. So here I just like to, again, roll this out and kind of finger press this with my fingers. So I make sure I get the whole seam out before I run the iron on top. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And then come up here to the corner, roll that out. And now we need to come around this curve here. Okay, roll this with your fingers, get it looking good. You can certainly use any kind of spray starch product that you might like when doing this as well, and that can help your garment look really nice. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, and then let's come over here to our loops. Make sure we get this seam out. Okay, I think that that's looking really good. There. Let's give it a press. Okay. So now our dress bodice is looking more like a dress bodice. So look how pretty that is with your piping and your sash here. So now what we're going to need to do before we sew these side seams here, we need to construct the side sashes because we're actually going to put those inside this seam, which is, again, a variation from the original pattern. So I really want to show you how to do that. So let's grab our side sashes and get those made.